So as we continue to look at different aspects of Jesus and strive to reconcile how this man could be just like us, but yet unique, we're going to take a look today at his death and resurrection. Now, none of us, of course, have died as of yet, so I won't be talking about us. But we will be talking about some of the quote-unquote famous religious leaders, prophets, what have you, as we've been doing for this month. Now, some would say the idea of death and resurrection is, I don't know, it's just a copy of a copy of a copy, right? It seems that it's within every religious thought. It's within, every different school of religion, what have you, whatever you want to call those things. That it's nothing new. It's, it's almost as if Jesus is just another in a long line of myths of supposed gods who follow this archetype, right? We talked about this back in, March, was it? Or whenever? We watched Zeitgeist, which talked about the god Horus, how each day he fights with his brother Set, and at the end of the day, Set kills him, and he dies, and thus we have night. And then he is reborn again to rise again at the dawn to start the fight all anew, death and resurrection. We talk about the god Isis. As you go throughout the year and you have the spring and summer, Isis is alive and strong, and then starts to weaken as autumn comes. And Isis' death is broadcast through nature all around as leaves fall from trees. The very nature of the season that is known as autumn, we call here in America frequently fall, because it is death coming. And then the winter, the long, cold death, only to witness in spring the resurrection, the bringing back of life as trumpeted by the earth itself as plants grow up and push through the soil and begin to flower again. Death and resurrection. See, the main difference here is those are man's explanation for continuous cycles that take place. You continue to see those cycles in place, and in some places, some people still worship those same gods or saviors and explain the cycles the same way. Jesus doesn't follow that death and resurrection cycle as it's described in other religions at all. There's no cycle that is continued on and on and on that explains anything that we would experience in nature. The sun doesn't fight against the night to die and then stay dark for 3 days before rising again. The year doesn't go through a much longer winter as Jesus dies and then is dead for, if winter's about 4, 5 months, right? 15 months before the spring is brought back. You see, Christ's death and resurrection doesn't really follow the model that people try to push it into, but it's because they don't have an understanding of what is unique about his death and resurrection. So today we're going to take a little bit of time, and as we can already see, it doesn't kind of fit with those myths. Let's compare Jesus' death and resurrection, because everybody dies, right? Everybody dies. Some people are resurrected. So other people have died. Other people have been resurrected. We know that Jesus was crucified on a cross. Other people have been crucified on a cross. It wasn't a brand new method of death that was attributed only to him. So how can his death and resurrection be unique then if other people have died, and yet other people have been raised from the dead as well? Well, let's take a look at that. But before we get into Jesus himself, let's look at other religious leaders. If we're going to do some comparison, let's just see how they died and whether or not they were resurrected as well. Throughout the course of this year, you've heard the name Zoroaster several times. Zoroaster often associated later with the Mithras cult, which supposedly came out of that. And Mithras, of course, associated with Jesus, because supposedly it was a direct copy, even though Mithras itself came on alongside and adopted many of the Christian beliefs into it. So Zoroaster, so according to Al-Biruni, that's A-L-B-I-R-U-N-I, he lived from AD 973 to 1048. Zoroaster was killed by the Turians. In 1000 AD, the Shah Nama describes what happened. All before the fire of the Turkmens was slew, and swept the cult away. The fire erst Zerdust, Zoroaster that is, had litten of their blood did die, who slew the priest himself, I know not. Just to translate, the Turks came, burned, killed Zoroaster, and no one knows who actually killed him. We talked last week about, and there's no mention of resurrection, by the way, just to be clear. We talked last week about Siddhartha Gautama, who attained the title of Buddha. In his 80th year, as he was traveling, a disciple of his, a blacksmith, created a pork dish for him. Now, it was either a pork dish or it was a dish of truffles or fungus that was found by pigs, which isn't unheard of. Even in this day and age, the fine truffles are found with pigs. They have more of the sensitive snout for those types of things. After eating this truffle dish, this pork dish, he fell ill. So many say that he was either poisoned by his servant, or he succumbed to food poisoning, or, as Oregon Trail would tell us, died of dysentery. No one is sure exactly what happened, but it is attributed to that food that he ate. Is someone out there? Okay. So it's attributed to the food that he ate. But Buddha did not experience death. See, Buddha went into deep meditation and got to the 8th level of meditation before he came back down to the 3rd level and told his servants that they should not follow any man's commands. And then he ascended again spiritually to the 8th level, and his spirit did not experience the death of his body, but his body did die. It's amazing. So just to translate, Buddha died because of food poisoning. His body was then cremated, and his ashes were distributed among 8 cities. And they were set up as shrines throughout Asia. So there is definitely no resurrection of the body for Buddha. He is literally in ashes. Let's move on to Muhammad. In 632, Muhammad became ill with headaches and fever, and he died from that. Before he died, he exhorted the Arabs to remain united, to abolish usury and any blood feuds, and he announced that if he owed anything to anyone, that they could claim it. It is said that a hush fell over the crowd, and only one man stepped forward to claim a few coins. Muhammad finally succumbed and was buried in the house of his wife, who had nursed him during his last days. His tomb is in Medina, and after Mecca is one of the most venerated sites of Muslims. Now remember, Muhammad himself never claimed himself to be a god, never claimed himself to be sinless, but he is venerated as such. But he has died, and they know exactly where his tomb is. In fact, they visit it yearly. Now, I could go on and on and on, but then you would have nothing left to research yourself. So I would implore you to explore the wealth of knowledge that is available, to look at how other religious leaders died and if they were resurrected, and if it compares at all to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. What would you say is probably our best source for information about Jesus' death and resurrection? The Bible. Is there a specific spot in the Bible that we may be able to read about these things? The Gospels. Thank you. The Gospels are, by and large, the most comprehensive information that we have about the death of Jesus. Unlike Siddhartha, we know exactly what his cause of death was. Unlike Muhammad, there weren't any speeches asking for people to live without any hate. And if I owe you anything, please come and take it from me. Unlike Zoroaster, there was no great battle that was fought, and he was not slowed by an unknown soldier. According to Luke 23, Jesus was tried by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. He was then crucified alongside two other criminals. And now, in spite of some of the vivid examples you might have seen or heard of, such as the Passion of the Christ, it's not graphically spelled out here, other than to say pretty much just simply in Luke 23:33 that they crucified him. There's an understanding of what that death looked like. Now, the Roman practice of crucifixion is barbaric. It does involve some blood, but the whole idea that it would be a quick, painful death is fiction. It is designed to last up to 2 days of torture up on the cross. People were often put along roadsides and entrances to cities, and their bodies left to hang there. Those that were crucified were never buried because they stood as a reminder of what it meant to cross the Romans. A sign would often be placed above their head describing what their crime was, so that as you walked into the city and you saw these people or bones or whatever, you would see what their crime was and never wish to do that yourself. The Romans wanted the victim to suffer as long as possible. The idea was that if you saw it yourself, you would never want to go through it. The Roman orator Quintilian, in around 35 to 90 CE, observed that whenever we crucify the guilty, the most crowded roads are chosen. There most people can see and be moved by fear. For penalties relate not so much to retribution as to their exemplary effect. So from a Roman perspective, the horror of crucifixion was a horror of social shame. Executed publicly, situated on well-trafficked routes, devoid of clothing, denied burial, and left to be eaten by birds and beasts, and viciously ridiculed. Rome, in fact, did not expose its own citizens to this form of punishment, reserved it for those who resisted any type of imperial rule. Luke explains that Jesus' death in many ways must have been regarded as an enemy of the state. The sign placed above his head, the King of the Jews. We read that and say, oh, well, Pontius Pilate recognized this is what is said of him. Jesus himself said, you said it, when Pontius said, are you the King of the Jews? But assuming rule would have been seen as trying to usurp the authority of Rome and the king or regent that Rome had put in place in the city. So the crime that he was not guilty of, though the sign stated, was basically that he was perverting the people. He was forbidding the payment of taxes to Caesar, claiming to be the king, stirring up the people, signaling rebellion or unrest. So when push comes to shove, basically he was running afoul of the interests of both Romans and Israelites. Now on the cross, he died in a very, very specific manner. Now we have the ability, and we've experienced many different deaths. We even have, death with dignity laws that allow us to end our lives when we want to, because we just can't live anymore. So we can decide often how we want to die. Sometimes we die in our sleep. Sometimes we die in a frantic battle. We suffer through struggles, both physically and mentally. And we do whatever we can to frantically hold on to that life, but not Jesus. When Jesus was up on the cross, he was given a sponge soaked in vinegar to drink. And once he had drank from that sponge, he simply proclaimed, "It is finished." And then he breathed his last breath. His head hung down as he was suspended between the nails. Even in death, we see that he was in control. This was the path that he was supposed to take. When Jesus dismissed the spirit and died, the soldiers nearby were surprised that he had died so quickly. Because again, crucifixion was meant to take a long time, and you were meant to wail in pain when you could breathe at all. In fact, when they went and broke the legs of the criminals beside him so they could speed along their death, they found no need to do that for Jesus because he had already died. And the only reason they had gone to break the legs of the criminals was because it was coming up on the Sabbath, and they wanted to end the process quickly so that the Jewish people might celebrate their Sabbath in peace. When Jesus died, Matthew records that the temple curtain in the Holy of Holies, thick, heavy curtain, was torn asunder. The earth was blackened, the sun covered, and the earth shook. It was quite literally an earth-shaking event. In addition to that, burial chambers broke open, and some of the dead people that were in those burial chambers came back to life and joined their loved ones. Jesus left no unfinished work. He accomplished everything that God the Father had set for him. He completed his mission to the full. Then, as a break from Roman tradition, he was brought off of the cross and placed into a tomb, the tomb that Joseph of Arimathea had purchased, that was carved into rock. And then Roman soldiers were posted around this tomb because the Jewish leaders came to Pontius Pilate and they said they might try to steal his body. Then, of course, when the women disciples came to the tomb early on Sunday to complete the anointing process, they found that the tomb was empty and the guards had fled. Now, unlike what you would expect if there was, say, a grave robbery, the burial clothes were still there in the tomb. Nothing else was disturbed except for Jesus' body was no longer there to be found. And it's not enough that there was an empty tomb, but Jesus then also appeared to Mary Magdalene, to his disciples. He appeared in a room where the disciples had barricaded themselves. He also appeared to a multitude of disciples on the mountain in Galilee and in Jerusalem before he ascended. He was around for at least 40 more days after his supposed death. There is documents that prove of this sighting that show that mass hallucination. There we go. Hey, I said it. Mass hallucination on that scale is not a thing. It's not feasible. It's not even possible. Jesus also appeared sometime later to Saul of Tarsus as he was on the road to Damascus. Saul, of course, was a fanatical persecutor of Christianity. He was then renamed Paul and then worked to spread the news of Jesus' death and resurrection. So just to summarize real quick here, he was sentenced to death as an innocent man for setting himself against the rule of Roman Israel. As Jesus hung on the cross, he died when he willed. And instead of taking the up to 2 days, he died the very day he was set on the cross. In fact, when they came to hasten that by breaking his legs, they found that he was already dead. They pierced his side, and blood and water flowed out, showing that had taken place already for him. Breaking with Roman tradition, he was allowed to be taken down and buried instead of remaining hung on the cross and allowing the birds and the beasts to eat of his flesh, instead of being kept up there as a warning for others. And then in the tomb, he rose again, left his burial clothes behind, and appeared to his disciples, and then ascended once more to heaven. So it's clear as you look at this that the death and resurrection of Jesus does not follow any type of myth or understanding or copy from any rituals. It doesn't follow the cyclical nature of supposed death and resurrections that are compared to it. In fact, if you look at the mystery religions and you try to judge a standard of death and resurrection as a historical fact, the only standard that you could apply to that is the standard of Jesus' death and resurrection. Because people refuse to apply the standard of the Christian idea of death and resurrection of Jesus, death and resurrection as a historical fact does not stand. Only because of that bias. No other person comes even close to this example. just no contest. So, with this understanding of who Jesus is, the way that he died and the way that he resurrected, with the understanding that he's unique among all so-called religious leaders, that he follows no other myth, no other cycle that has been written down, there's no repeatable process, that leaves us with just one conclusion. Jesus in his death and resurrection, just as Jesus in his life and Jesus in his person, is a unique individual, unlike anyone else. Jesus left no unfinished work, and that's why he said it is finished. So with this understanding, your next question is, what do I do with that, James? I kind of already understood that, I celebrate Easter, celebrate Christmas, so, I know Jesus died and was resurrected. How does this apply to your life? I'm not going to tell you that. I'm going to have you reason that, because I have only 2 questions for you to help get that process started. My first question: since Jesus left no unfinished work, have you even identified the work that you have been made to accomplish? Have you even identified the work that you've been made to accomplish? And follow that up with, what methods have you used to identify the work that God has placed before you? It's a time of contemplation. We can't finish the work that God has given us if we don't know the work that God has given us. So what methods have you used to identify the work that has been placed before you by God? Go ahead and take time to discuss in our cell groups, and then we'll return back to conclude today.